So I wanted to start with a brief PowerPoint presentation, just introducing ourselves to some essential questions about educational research. So there are a few preliminary things to say in my brief introduction here. The first being that given that these are essential questions, there really is no right answer to any of them. And in reality, there are many different types of answers, and they can be answered in many different types of ways. Now, the reason that saying that is important is because when you write your research proposal, whether it be for this class or for your dissertation proposal or for articles you write in the future, you will have to justify the choices that you are making methodologically and justifying why what you're doing and how what you're doing has impact and how and why what you're doing counts as educational research. So essentially, you are going to have to think about these essential questions and come up with some sort of answer for each of them each time you engage in a work of educational research and attempt not only in the planning of it, but as you try to justify it to others. Now, having said that, I also wanted to say that this is an introduction to 8 essential questions, but again, it is just some essential questions. We easily could have come up with more, but I just made these up, so you'll bear with me for their comprehensiveness or lack thereof. So what I wanted to do in this brief presentation was just kind of just overview what these questions are asking, what they are about, and what we will be doing for the rest of the semester in the course is using each other and our ideas and also readings to think about answers to these questions, different potential answers, that is. So the first question is, what counts as educational research? What are the standards for educational research? So probably the most important documents here will be the AERA documents that provide some standard. But again, I think it's worth considering that those were standards that, again, just didn't materialize or come out of the sky. They were written by people, and they are standards that could be revised in the future. But again, anytime we write or engage in a project of educational research, the onus falls upon us to answer the question, is what we're doing research? And if so, how? And if we are doing research, what are the standards by which we can judge whether or not something is educational research? So questions like, does it have to be quantitative? Does it have to be generalizable? Does it have to have a large sample size? What are the types of research questions that will be asked, etc.? So those are the types of questions we'll be looking at here. So really, this is probably the most essential question of all. The second question is, what is the role of theory and theoretical frameworks in the practice of educational research? What is the role of epistemology in educational research? Often you will hear your advisors, your professors, or the peer reviewers who are looking at your reviewing your manuscripts saying, what is the theoretical framework? So what is the role of theory in the practice of educational research? Do we just simply need to have the methods? Is it enough to say, oh, I'm just interviewing people, or I'm looking at survey data and I'm just crunching the numbers using statistical software? Why do we need to have a theoretical framework? And how can we use theory and theoretical frameworks to inform the way we go about research, the way we go about analyzing data, the way we talk about the implications that our research has? And likewise, the question about epistemology. Epistemology, of course, relating to the study of knowledge. How do we know something? What different theories of epistemology, how do those theories matter as we are constructing our methodology? Question number 3, what is the role of generalizability in educational research? So essentially what this is asking is it okay, or how big does a sample size have to be? Or is it okay to have just a case study of just one? And a related but somewhat different question is, do the results have to be generalizable? So if I, let's say, survey all the students in a school, do I have to say, well, therefore the implications are this can generalize to all different schools in this city or in the country? Or is it okay if I say, no, you can't generalize from this data? Again, it kind of goes back to the first essential question. Is it research if it's not generalizable? That's obviously an important question. And it'll also go to the question later about the question of impact. How generalizable is your research study going to be? Are the results going to be? And how generalizable does it have to be in order for us to consider the project to be a work of educational research? Number 4, what is engaged scholarship and what are the standards for engaged scholarship? Now, while there are no right or wrong definitive answers to this question, there certainly has been a lot written about how engaged scholarship, or we might call it community engaged scholarship, or the scholarship of engagement, it can go under different names, but how that's different from quote-unquote traditional research endeavors. So how is it different? That is, if I'm engaging a community in the research process, I'm doing research with the community. I'm not doing it to the community. I'm not going to a school, giving out a survey to the students and then leaving. That would not be engaged scholarship. But if I go to the school and work with them on solving a problem that they have, and the stakeholders in the school or in the community are, partners in this research project, how does that change the way we engage in the process of research and in the process of scholarship? What are the implications for how we build those relationships, for how much time the research takes, for how we construct the methodology, for how we analyze the results, for the type of impact that it has? And again, going back to standards, do the same standards for traditional research apply, and or are there additional sets of standards that need to be considered when engaging with a community partner? So given that this is an important field of research unto itself, and one could perhaps even argue that all educational research to some degree is applied in the sense that it's involving stakeholders, it's involving schools, students, parents, teachers. It's important to think about what it means to engage the community in the research process and how that might change the way we think about scholarship and how we construct our research methodologies. Question number 5. How are effective research partnerships and collaborations between researchers and communities formed? And really, this question should ask, how are they formed and how are they maintained throughout the research process? If I'm working with a community for 2 years on a research project, there are tensions and negotiations that need to occur throughout that process of that relationship. There are things that, data, let's say, that I want to have access to that maybe they don't want me to have access to, or vice versa, things they want me to do that maybe I don't have the time or the resources to do, or that the university research team has time to do. So how are those tensions negotiated? Obviously, this is directly related to the last question. But again, this is something worth thinking about, as people have written a lot about building careers around the scholarship of outreach and engagement. It is essential to think about how to form those partnerships and how to maintain those partnerships, and what resources in terms of both, emotional energy and time are needed in order to make sure that the collaborative partnership is reciprocal and mutually beneficial. Let me just also say that mutually beneficial relationship is indeed one of the standards for engaged scholarship. It can't just be a one-way street. It has to be mutual benefit to both parties. And then question 5 is really asking, okay, well, how do you achieve and maintain that reciprocity? Essential question number 6. Do the life, the emotions, and the subjectivity of the researcher belong in educational research? Again, this seems like a fairly essential question to ask as we go about thinking about constructing research. You'll see a lot of research where there is no researcher present, and by that I mean it's just crunching numbers. It seems like there were some mysterious quote-unquote researchers did the study, they crunched the numbers, here are the results. A large-scale quantitative study, for example, where the results lie in the numbers themselves. And so in that case, you wouldn't see the life, the emotions, and the subjectivity of the researcher. But then you might also read autoethnographies, where, for example, the sample size might be a case study of 1, and the case study might be just the researcher, him or herself, and the data, quote unquote, might simply be the life, the emotions, and the subjectivity of the researcher. And the essential question to ask is that research? I don't think anybody would begrudge anyone from writing an autoethnography or an autobiography. Why not? Do what you want to do. But where sometimes contentious debates occur is that people begin to ask the question, well, you wrote in your diary every day, and that's fine with me, but now you're saying that that's educational research. Is that educational research? And again, this goes back to, how do we justify these questions? How do we answer these questions? What justifications do we give? I think about this question about very much being related to question number 2. What is the role of theory and epistemology in how we frame and justify methodology and educational research itself? And those theories and epistemologies are going to have implications for whether or not we consider life, emotions, subjectivity, personal opinions, personal experiences, all of those things to be considered legitimate educational research. It's also worth going back to this first question, and we think about the AERA standards. There's a set of standards for empirical data studies, and then there are a set of standards for humanities-oriented research studies. And so that right away kind of gives the clue that there are maybe 2 different camps or schools of thought or ways of framing educational research. One where we could talk about empirical data, where we might consider just the empirical data to be measurements of some standardized kind, which again, going back to this question, can potentially be generalized. And then here we talk about life and emotions, where things maybe are not generalizable, or the data is much more, let's say, ephemeral than results on a test score. And so how do we justify that as being data? That's what this essential question is all about. We could also ask, what are the implications for that research as well? That's going to go to a later question. Number 7, how, where, and with whom should the results of educational research be communicated? Does this differ for different genres of educational research, qualitative, quantitative, and engaged scholarship? So a couple of things to quickly say here on this topic, which is you very often hear the complaint that, you know, as scholars, as researchers, as professors, basically the currency or the coin of the realm, one might say, is to be published and to be published in top tier ranking journals. Now, the irony of this is that of the more and more top tier, the more and more exclusive the outlet for the research becomes, the fewer people read it because it's more and more specialized. So you probably are not going, if we think about educational research, you're probably not going to have teachers, practicing teachers reading AERJ or even the Journal of Teacher Education. These are specialized journals on specialized topics, where a person, again, if we go back to thinking about what the standards for research are, we're talking about advanced methodologies, we're talking about, data that is analyzed in sophisticated ways, that it's not designed for a practitioner to understand, or even a non-practitioner, just a community stakeholder. It's designed for a specialist to understand. So that's all very well and good, but then you have practitioner journals, let's say, where the results are geared more for a practitioner audience. And in the case of engaged scholarship, you might have, there's justification that distributing pamphlets, informational booklets, training videos, that can be considered the product, the output. And we might even say a scholarly product because it's having impact in the context of the community engaged scholarship. So again, this question of how, where, and with whom should the results be communicated is very different depending on how the research is framed, what methodological choices guide it, and what the stated purposes of the research are. Last thing I'll say here is also the how. Again, as I was saying before, the coin of the realm is the journal article or the book. But do books and journal articles have to be the only way that quote-unquote research is communicated? Can a painting be the output of research? Can a performance be the output of research? As I was saying before, can an informational training video be how the research results are communicated? Again, as I said at the beginning, there's no right or wrong answer to these questions, no definitive answers, but any answer that we give needs to be justified. And last but not least, how do we measure and assess the impact of educational research? How can educational research improve quality of work? How can educational research improve the quality of life? Just like question number 1, which was asking what is research, what counts as research, pretty much I've bookended the questions where this is pretty much the other main question that one might consider being one of the most important. Why are we doing any of this? What's the point of doing research in the first place? And again, this can be justified any number of different ways. If we're publishing in top-tier journals, Journal of Teacher Education, AERJ, Educational Researcher, name your favorite journal. That's all very well and good, but are we just doing that so we can talk to a more exclusive audience of specialized peers? Are we just doing it for our own career advancement? Is that the impact that it has? How does it impact the field? And of course, all of those scholars would say that what they're doing is impacting the field, but then we just have to justify how. So when you publish a very specialized book or a very specialized journal article, how is it that that journal article is going to have impact? One might say one of the ways to measure the impact is how often it's cited by researchers in the future. That could be, well, this book changed the world, or this article changed the way people think about this particular issue, or these results, these empirical results changed the way we think about how we educate teachers, for example, or how we teach mathematics, something like that, or how students learn to read most effectively. So in that sense, it might have impact because it impacts the field. It impacts how other scholars think. If we think about it in terms of the context of a practitioner journal, I could say, well, the journal article itself was geared in such a way that many teachers read it. And as a result, because the teachers read the article, they changed their practices, and therefore it had a huge impact. We might also think about, again, back to the engaged scholarship idea. I was working with the community, and we developed a training video, or we developed an intervention. We developed a new curriculum. The teachers and I developed a new curriculum together, and then we implemented it, and it had an impact on this community. So we might even say, well, it doesn't have the broad sweeping impact that, say, a national or international journal article might have, and that there are hundreds and thousands of people reading it all over the world, but they're all specialists, and then just quoted in a literature review. Instead, I can say, well, this had big impact because I was working with one school, and the work that the school and I did had a direct impact on the lives of the parents, students, and teachers in that school. But again, it all goes back to how we define impact and how we measure impact and how we justify that in the research proposal or the research article that we are writing. So I will end by saying what I started with, which is that however you answer these questions, it is incumbent upon you to think about these essential questions as you write your research proposal in any context, and as you plan, prepare, engage in, and present the results of your research endeavors.